Hey everyone, welcome to Summoning Saturdays. It is Saturday. I have made it. I have succeeded. It is actually Saturday. It's not even like 1 a.m. or something, and therefore technically Sunday. I am rather proud of myself for this. I just have to say, it's been kind of hard to do these. Winter, not just winter, but specifically really cold temperatures have been really hard to through, and it's I think everybody's been really, really put off by just how hard this winter has been this year. Climate change is real and it's definitely affecting us. So I hope everybody is dealing with it the best they can. So I want to talk today about Mercury. I want to talk about the planetary influence in specific, but I, because of that, also want to be talking about the metal. So when it comes to alchemy and magic, the planetary influence is the metal. Um, Mercury and Quicksilver are essentially the same thing in alchemy. Mercury itself, the planet is an expression of the metal. The metal is an expression of the planet. These are how correspondences work. I will say that the planet itself would be like the purest expression of Mercury. That's where the force is coming from. But the force of Mercury arises in our planet from the actual metal of Mercury and associated compounds and other things that are Mercury influenced. The reason this is important is because Mercury itself, the metal, has properties um, that are very specific to it chemically, and they are mercurial. Are in fact planetary in nature, and you can do a lot when it comes to magic. Um, you can also a lot on just like how you can best do magic when it comes to Mercury, but also there's a lot to be careful about. There's I'm not going to say danger because I I feel like danger doesn't really help people. It's more that um, Mercury has its highs and its lows. Its influence is sometimes going to be difficult to work with. It's not going to be as straightforward. Um, Sometimes people say that the planets have their light side and their shadow side. For instance, with Saturn, most people associate it with its shadow side instead of its light sides because it's got such a dark reputation, as it were. When it comes to Mercury, Mercury has two reputations, I find. One is the medical reputation, because everybody associates the catecheist with the medical profession instead of Asclepius's staff, which is the actual figure who was associated with healing and had a staff with a snake on it. Mercury's catecheist basically got associated with Asclepius's staff, and that's why it is the symbol of medicine now. Now, I will say that associating Mercury with medicine and doctors is so a good correspondence. So I feel that the story of that is a bit tangled because it would be perfectly fine to use a symbol of Mercury instead of Asclepius' staff, and a symbol of Mercury ends up being the catecheist. So, kind of like I feel Asclepius actually kind of goes under the ranks of Mercury when it comes to healers. So, Mercury is a healing force. The thing about healing, though, medicine in particular, is that medicine is often the use of poison to affect a medicinal outcome. The use of poison to treat something and therefore make your body better by kind of proving against the poison. Medicine is basically us taking poison and crafting it into something that has a healing effect for us. And this is very true when it comes to Mercury's metallic form, Quicksilver. Quicksilver, I'm going to try to say Quicksilver when I refer to the metal, and Mercury when I refer to the planet, by the way, since Quicksilver is just a synonym for the metal of Mercury, and it really, really helps us keep things simple. So, Quicksilver has certain properties, and it's actually quite poisonous to us. Most children know by now not to play with Mercury, not to play with Quicksilver. And I hope that most children know not to play with Quicksilver. Now, that's the thing. That is something that I would have said whenever I was a kid. I was one of the children who knew not to play with Quicksilver because we were all taught not to break a mercury thermometer open and play with the little blobs of metal that come out, because it's a liquid metal at room temperature. Mercury is liquid, and if you try to touch it, it will actually go away from your finger. Like the blobs of mercury will skate across the surface of wherever it is, and you can kind of chase it around with your finger. Except that eventually the mercury will absorb into your finger, and then you will get mercury poisoning. So this isn't a good idea, because quicksilver poisoning is in fact very, very it's very impactful. It has very profound effects. It's not something that like it's not something minor. That's why mercury, quicksilver, is considered to be such an environmental hazard. It is heavier than water, so if it's in an aquifer, or if it's any body of water, if it's in the drinking water, then it stays at the bottom of the reservoir where it's harder to find, and it often affects the bottom feeders in the food chain. Now, mercury can cause birth defects. But one particular thing that I've actually linked a cartoon in the description of the video. It's a cartoon on YouTube. It's from Colombia. It's a rival to Looney Tunes, I guess. It's from 1940, very, very, very dated, and purpose so, because you wouldn't find this matter talked about in anything much later than that. And it is, I think it's called the Mad Hatter. Mad Hatter. It's just called Mad Hatter. So it's very insensitive to the topic of mental illness. I'm going to give you that heads. If you watch this cartoon, you're going to see a bunch of men who are considered invalids behind bars in jackets that are padlocked. All of the cartoon depictions of mental illness that you've seen in Looney Tunes, or maybe not by now, just like there's not a lot of mercury thermometers anymore, and so I don't know how many children are actually educated not to play with mercury. I don't know how many times people have seen a crazy person, in quotations, depicted doing this. But that's in the cartoon, and it used to be in a lot of Looney Tunes. I don't know if it still is. But this was back when mental institutions and sanitariums were old style. If you know American Horror Story Asylum, I mean that's the old style institutions that they're talking about there. And those all got basically ended in America in the 80s. Ronald Reagan shut them down, and I'm not saying it was a good or a bad thing, because there were a lot of not great things that were happening in them. But if they had reformed them, then people would actually have a place to go when they have mental illness, as opposed to being on the streets. So the cartoon shows a particular sector of the mentally ill in 1940, which is hatters. Now, why hatters be considered to be, as a whole, as a trade, mentally ill? It turns out, and you find out in the comments of the YouTube video, it's one of the places where YouTube educates quite a lot, in fact. Check the lens here. There we go. I feel like it needs some cleaning. It turns out that the supplies that hatters were using to make hats in the early 1900s were in fact off-gassing mercury gas. So hatters were breathing in gaseous mercury while trying to do their jobs, and there was an illness. Many of them were getting mentally ill and they were unable to do their jobs. There was a Like, it was highly known at the time, basically, that if you were a hatter, there was a good possibility that you were experiencing some sort of mental illness from doing your job. And they didn't have any good way of talking about this, in my opinion. Um, you can see that from the cartoon. It's not a very sensitive way of depicting it. The whole point of the cartoon is that hatters are subjecting themselves to immense hazards to create women's hats in specific. Hats look crazy because hatters are crazy. And the reason that hatters are crazy at the time is because of mercury gas. It's gaseous quicksilver. So can involve hallucinations, involve a lot of psychosis, which is basically hallucinations. And there's also other things that people would be experiencing because of mercury poisoning. There are a lot of effects to mercury, and specifically, it depends on which form you're exposed to as well, what it is that you're going to be experiencing. But mental illness is a huge part of the effect of quicksilver poisoning. Now, this is very interesting when it relates to the planet of Mercury, because the thing is, the planetary forces rule over in neutrality. They do not really have an evil or a good side. I don't really feel that they have light and dark sides. They are just total forces. Mercury rules over maintenance and communication. All maintenance and communication. It rules over the mental arts and the art of using tools, craft mastering, jack of all trades, and of course the art of healing. So because Mercury rules in totality over healing, Mercury is also going to rule over sickness. So just like Mercury is going to be able to tap into the force of mental healing, it's also going to be able to tap into the force of mental sickness, which means that I'm not going to say that Mercury is responsible for all mental illness, but Mercury can answer for whatever is going on with mental illness. Basically, if you have difficulty with mental illness and you want some spiritual insight about that, you want some meditational insight about that, like if you want to really get medical help with your mental illness, you should go to a medical professional. If you go to Mercury will probably inspire you to go to a doctor. You shouldn't replace your doctor with the planet Mercury. The planet Mercury is what rules over your doctor. So this is really more about connecting better with the forces of medicine, the forces of maintenance, the forces of healing, of fixing, of crafting. Just like he rules over crafting, he also rules over when things break, and things break sometimes, and it sucks when things break. A lot of people focus on Mercury when it comes to Mercury retrograde. That is the other thing that people know about Mercury from, is Mercury retrograde. Everybody's complaining about Mercury retrograde all the time. Oh no, Mercury's going backwards again. Oh no, my clocks are breaking and my electronics are glitching out and everything's, everybody's communicating badly and nothing's working out because of Mercury retrograde. And anyone with a more in-depth knowledge of astrology will know that it's not that simple. That Mercury retrograde isn't about everything just breaking. It is working in reverse, or, it's not like we're suddenly, instead of Superman, it's Bizarro Superman. Mercury in retrograde is basically dealing with a new understanding of the same force of Mercury. For instance, whenever we deal with time, most humans are used to dealing with linear time. One thing comes after another, after another. First one thing happens, then another thing happens after that, then another thing happens after that. And if you want to talk about the sequence, it'll always be 1, 2, 3. Whenever you want to talk about the first event, you're always going to acknowledge the fact that it came before the second event, and that came before the third event, and the second was in between the first and the third. The order will always be the same. Time is about keeping things in order. Well, that's linear time in a certain direction of progression. But what if you go 3, 2, 1? What if you go from future to past? That's not something that we tend to consider in human experience. As humans, we typically experience time from past to present to future in that direction. When Mercury is going retrograde, from the Earth's point of view, it looks like Mercury is going in the opposite direction that it usually does. It does this about a third of the year. So a third of the time, Mercury, from our perspective, is going the other way. This is just a trick of it. Mercury hasn't changed its direction at all. It's still on the same bearing. It's just we're looking at each other from a different point of view. So you're getting maybe another side of Mercury, but it's still the same Mercury. When Mercury is in retrograde, you have the opportunity to learn from the other point of view. And Mercury is very much about education. It's not the only one involved in education. They're all here to teach you something. I'd say Saturn is the other main teacher when it comes to the planets and education. Saturn and Mercury are kind of like the two sages. But Mercury is very interesting because I do not see Saturn associated as much with mental illness. I do see it associated somewhat with mental illness. There's the madness of Saturn eating his children, for instance, and there's the association of lead with madness just as much as Quicksilver is associated with madness. And it's very interesting. Both of them are teachers and both of them are associated with madness. But lead is a bit more about quieting the intellect, whereas Quicksilver is it warps and weirds. If you've seen Quicksilver, it's a blob of silvery metal that reflects everything around it. In fact, I've got a good piece over here that is similar to Quicksilver without being the same. So this is actually a fushigi. If you know fushigi, the contact juggling thing, fushigi is Japanese for mystery, by the way, or mysterious. Anyway, it's just a little metal ball inside a sheath of acrylic. But I mean, this is essentially what Mercury looks like whenever you have it in person. It's just reflecting. It's just solid silver, but extremely reflective. It reflects everything around it. And so whenever you represent Mercury with correspondences, often Mercury is either colored rainbow or it's a mixture of colors to confer the understanding that it reflects everything. And it's different than, like, the moon is accorded to silver. Usually the moon is what gets the color silver in alchemy. And so Mercury usually ends up with like a purple or an orange, depending on what you've given the other planets. So visually, Mercury is kind of not just reflecting everything around it, but warping it. You can see here, it's kind of like that MC Escher picture where he's got his hand and he's, drawing his hand. You can see the whole room. You can see everything in that ball. And so it's also like, very, very curved, very, very warped, not the same perspective that we're used to seeing all the time. Mercury doesn't just give us a different perspective, but it forces things into a different perspective that is very warped from our point of view, and it can be very, very, very disorienting. Just like whenever you take medicine, it helps treat the illness, but you often will feel a kind of sickness from the medicine. For instance, Dizziness is a common symptom of many medications. Sorry, I'm trying to find a place to put this thing down. There we go. Dizziness is a common symptom of many medications. Um, Often, people will need, to sleep. Drowsiness is another common symptom. Inability to operate machinery. Um, like it, medicine takes its toll. There is an exchange that you get for receiving the healing that it confers. And when it comes to Mercury, there's a lot that you can learn from Mercury. There's a lot that you can gain from Mercury, but it's going to take something, and that something that it takes is sometimes your sanity. Now, I'm going through an interesting thing where I don't have mercury poisoning, but I do have poisoning from a very similar substance in terms of effect. And it's not this one. I experienced long-term methane poisoning. There was a gas leak in my house, and I didn't know about it for quite an extended period. And it turns out that methane poisoning has long-term effects. And I'm not going to call them similar to mercury poisoning, quicksilver poisoning, because I don't know enough about both to really say that outright, but I will say that they do share one symptom in common, which is the hallucinations. So, methane poisoning, as far as I can tell, doesn't have long-term hallucinations associated with it. It's not like LSD where you end up tripping randomly after. But instead, because you experienced hallucinations whenever you experienced the methane poisoning, afterwards there is a mental tax. There's a mental toll that is paid for having experienced those mental states, which people usually don't go through. So I'm currently recovering from that. I'm recovering from a very mercurial experience. And the experience of having the delusions and the hallucinations was actually, in its own way, healing. I don't want to say that that was the thing that I needed at the time, or that without that I couldn't have done blah, blah, blah. It's more that I experienced that, and it was quite difficult to experience, but I ended up being able to come away from it with some growth as well, because that's what I decided to take out of it. You can take the poison and turn it into your medicine deliberately. That's something that you have to try to do. It's something that you have to do deliberately. It's you have to put in the work for that to happen. I mean, that part of the work of alchemy is making your own medicine. It's the chemistry, the physiology, and the spirituality, and the psychology, and the philosophy of making your own medicine out of what is poison. Sometimes this means, in the pursuit of alchemy, you're going to be exposed to what's poison, and you're going to be susceptible to it. You're going to end up being poisoned. Be susceptible to it. You're going to end up being poisoned. It's more that exposure happens. And part of being educated about how to be an alchemist is that if there is an accident anywhere, not even with your own stuff, but maybe somebody else's, you can help with the accident because you know what to do. You've prepared yourself. You know how to take the poison, the accident, and turn it into the cure, which is growth, progression, change that's actually beneficial. So you can sometimes take a poisonous situation and turn it to your advantage. That's alchemy of healing as well. Mercury is quite good at taking, I would say that a good example would be he killed one of Apollo's sacred bulls, and um, this was whenever he was like a little kid. He ended up making a musical instrument out of it, the first lyre. And the lyre is like, the horns curved on the outsides, and then there's like some bars here that sort of strap them together, and then like another you have the strings of the lyre coming down, and it's a strumming instrument like a harp. It's a crude harp made out of bull's horns. Mercury made the first lyre out of that, and then Apollo came and he's like, "Where the hell is my bull?" And Mercury is like, "Well, you're probably not even interested in your bull at this point because I have just invented the first musical instrument, and it's for you." And Apollo was so excited by this gift that he did not make near as much of a fuss about his bull being dead as you think he would have. Basically, Mercury saved his own life. It wasn't. Apollo was one of the foremost gods, and he's sometimes considered to be like the top god, depending upon which cult you're from, or depending on which variant of the religion you're from. But he's quite a powerful and sovereign god, and he was like definitely top of the totem pole compared to Mercury, who was like new in town, kind of a nobody, and I believe he had a mother too. So it was like he was sort of born in secret, trying to be kept away from everyone else, and but said, "Hey, I've made you a musical instrument, Apollo. This is totally for you. I did this for you. That's why I used your bull, because it's for you." And that saved his butt. Huge crisis for Mercury, and instead it becomes a boon, because after that Apollo was like, "Oh yeah, Mercury is like my." I will say it. I should probably be a boon, because after that Apollo was like, "Oh yeah, Mercury is like my." I will say it. I should probably be saying Apollo and Hermes. I don't remember if Apollo is the name in the Roman pantheon, or if it's like Apollon or something. So apologies for not getting it completely accurate for the names in the respective pantheons, but I think most people know what it is that I'm going for here. Like these myths are largely interchangeable between Greek and Roman, unless you get real deep into the paint when it comes to the details. So Mercury is kind of the god of turning one thing into the other thing. Sometimes you can consider him to be very binary. You can even consider him to be very bipolar. If you're familiar with the condition of bipolar, or if you're familiar with the general concept of like going between two different extremes, instead of having the specific mental illness of bipolar, just like the concept of here and no in between. I mean, Mercury, the planet, if you just see it in orbit around the sun, is very much like that. One side of it is completely exposed, very close to the sun, and so it's just completely scorched. The other side of it is completely in darkness. And so you've got hot and cold, and really like very little in between on the rim in the middle. A very interesting depiction of this is in Chronicles of Riddick, a movie starring oh gosh, what's his name? Fast and Furious guy, Vin Diesel, Groot. Groot is in Chronicles of Riddick, and he goes to Mercury at some point, and they're actually on the edge of Mercury, where between where the sun and this building kind of just like rolls, like moves constantly on this rim, and the the survival is making sure that you don't end up on either side of that line. But it's very interesting to see it depicted. Mercury is a planet of extremes, and understanding that you can only stay in one extreme for so long without harming yourself, that you can go only so far into the area of the extreme until either you harm yourself or you just get lost. I think that the scales, thinking of the scales of justice, just, one here and one here, the balances, this goes down, this goes up, this goes down, this goes up. They're always connected. If you want them in perfect balance, then it's very, very difficult to keep them in perfect balance. But let's say that this goes down this much and this one goes up this much. That's not too bad. But when you got this, it's very hard to get back. So Mercury is about paying attention to this here and keeping it in this area. And if you get here, learning how to, at least get here, and at least get here, and at least get here, and trying not to go from here to here to here to here, because that can break you. And Mercury understands that. Mercury wants to help you stay on the edge of the coin instead of on either very severe side of the coin. And Mercury can help you on that edge. Now, the thing is, Mercury is always going to be for that, and Mercury is always going to be doing that. Mercury is never going to be about not doing that, because Mercury is always doing that. Mercury as a planet will never be anything else than that. If you want to stay in an area where you could just sit down and chill and not have to be moving to stay alive, then you don't want to be on Mercury. You don't want to go to Mercury for that. If you want to be going for rest and recuperation, I would definitely say either Saturday or Sunday or Monday. Saturn, the sun, or the moon. And nowadays, I think that Sunday is considered a day of rest. So I'd go to the sun for that, because the sun has a normal day and night cycle. And, the moon you can also go to for that, since the moon is considered to rule over the night. So that's the time of rest. You don't want to go to Mercury for rest, because Mercury is the planet of work. Mercury is about diligence. In fact, the 7 alchemical planets can actually correspond to the 7 deadly sins and the 7 heavenly virtues. And the ones that correspond to Mercury would be sloth and diligence. Mercury is about determination. If you know that concept from Undertale, it's about keep going. Don't stop. Keep going. Now, it is also the planet of healing. And one of the things about healing is actually that you usually have to set aside time to rest to be able to heal, because healing is a kind of keep going for your body to help it get back into the state it needs to be. If your body is like this and it needs to be like this, then healing is the force that's moving the scales like this. But for that force to be able to do that, you have to take everything else that's in you and just lay it down. You have to rest. You're basically taking the forces that would normally be devoted towards doing your day-to-day work, going to your job, getting your chores done, getting things in your life done. You're taking all of that energy and you're putting it into correcting the scales instead. In fact, that's another part of balance, is allocating that energy. You cannot have infinite energy. You can't just say, okay, I need energy to heal, so I'm just going to get more energy and put that energy into healing. You can't do that. You can't just like eat extra lunch and then just the extra lunch will become the healing, and your regular lunch will become your day-to-day energy. You have to give up some of that energy that you put into other things day to day to put into healing. I mean, everyone has experienced this at some point. They've recuperated from an illness and they had to take some bed rest. If you hurt your leg, then you need to stop walking on that leg for a while so that it can have a chance to repair itself. It's just very simple concept. It's a trade, and Mercury understands everything about trades. It is, in fact, the planet of the trades, the trade of crafting or doctors or merchants, exchanges. Mercury is very, very binary in nature, not because of dogma, not because things have to be one or the other, but because Mercury is about trading one thing for another. They need to be equal, because if things are equal, then you can exchange one for the other. Very, very mathematical. So Mercury can be very, very useful, especially if you combine it with other planets because of this. You could take Mercury and bring it into the equation, and it's the equal sign in the middle. And then it brings into balance, say, two other planets. Let's say you've got your Saturn. That is your planet of rest. It's the harvest. It's the education, scholarship. Sometimes it's old age and tradition and dogma and religion. And then let's say you've got Venus. Venus is pleasure and splendor. It is, I'd say, a full immersive dedication. To the self and the identity. Mercury is very, very concerned, or not, sorry, Mercury, Venus. Venus is very, very concerned with like growing the greens. It is the greenhouse planet and is very, very associated with the plant life and the growing of it. Whereas Saturn is like the fruits of that plant life and harvesting the fruits of that plant life. Venus is about growing that plant life to begin with. Venus is the garden. Saturn is the bushel of fruit that is harvested from that garden. So in the middle is Mercury, balancing between the two. For instance, if you consider just the work aspect of Mercury, Mercury would be balancing the work of growing the plants versus the work of harvesting the plants. You can't constantly be harvesting. You can't constantly be picking your apples. You've got to do all the other work of making sure that you get apples in the first place. At some point, you also have to recognize it's time to stop harvesting. At some point, you have to recognize that there's just nothing left to harvest. You have to recognize that whatever is left on the trees or whatever's on the ground isn't worth harvesting, and it's no longer yours. It's for the earth. Knowing when to stop, knowing when to move from that to another type of work, knowing when to not work at all. That ability to move off task into another task. Mercury is actually very good at it. Sometimes you can consider Mercury to be very ADHD. It is the planet of travel, the planet of delivery. The delivery person, Mercury is their god. And so, like, Mercury being the messenger going, Saturn understands making more. So Venus constantly always dedicated to that growth. Mercury constantly always dedicated to that movement. Saturn constantly dedicated to the usefulness at rest. Taking things and putting them into storage, putting them and setting them aside for long-term benefit. Investment. I would say that Saturn is the most interested in investment. Saturn's constantly investing. Now, the problem with investing is that if you invest all of your money, none of it's ever around to spend. But if you spend all of it on producing your stuff, then you have nothing left to do anything else in your business on. So you'd say that Mercury would be the one keeping your ledger. Mercury's a good accountant. That equals sign is very, very good for money. If you need assistance with finance, Mercury can definitely help kind of like get your head around it. I will say Jupiter is much better for long-term growth and like a good, like healthy money mindset. Mercury has a very busy mindset, constantly moving. And so you don't really want Mercury in total control of your spending. You want Mercury thinking about, okay, well, I've got this money here. I could be putting it into this, or I could be putting into this, or I could be putting into this. Where would it best go? How do I move it around? Mercury helps eliminate stagnancy. Saturn helps plant a seed and bury it and stay there. Venus and Mercury work together rather well, by the way. They actually have some mythology together. There is a deity called Hermaphrodite that is the child of Hermes and Aphrodite, which are Mercury and Venus. So they get along rather famously. I'd say Venus's growth and Mercury's movement, they harmonize well together. They can obviously dance. But Mercury and Saturn go together rather well as well because they have so much in common, especially when it comes to education, academia, scholarship. Two scribes, So whew. Mercury helps move things to where they need to be. And sometimes it may feel like it's very hard to stay in Mercury, stay focused on Mercury, because Mercury may be trying very hard to move you to something else, to a different planet, to just move you, because Mercury is always moving. This happens, don't be alarmed. That's how Mercury is, and that's what Mercury does for you. If it's retrograde time, then Mercury will probably be moving you to reflect onto the past for something. Mercury likes to educate us with the past. Mercury also likes to educate us with the future and towards the future. 2/3 of the time, Mercury is going towards the future. Only 1/3 of the time is it going towards the past. And whenever it does, it always does it for something important. If you're having Mercury retrograde malaise, then always remember that you could be reflecting on something in your past that's important, that you like, that you consider to be, worthy of teaching you. Try to do that. Try to find a memory that, you cherish. Now, when it comes to the madness of Mercury, I can't really say what to do with that because everyone has to choose what to do whenever they're faced with madness, and everyone makes different choices. What they do with madness says a lot about them. And having gone through quite a lot of exposure to a very dangerous hallucinogenic substance without any of my knowledge until after the fact, I will tell you that it can be very frightening. It can be very unbalancing. It can have a lot of hazards. Mercury tends to teach towards medicine, tends to teach towards healing. And so, like, quite honestly, one thing that I did during that period was that I reached out to my medical professional and I asked him, like, hey, do you think I should be doing anything right now? Whenever I had found out that it had happened and I was like getting the actual methane like dispersed and stuff, I was, asking my, medical consultant, I was like, hey, um, what do you suggest here? I'm doing everything according to what I can find in terms of like, methane poisoning guides. The problem with methane, by the way, is that it's not actually very toxic per se. Like, you don't really die of exposure to methane because of, cell death or something. It's that it causes all kinds of problems with like the mind and perception, and some other illnesses that are more subtle and hard to catch. So it's very sneaky. It's not something that you'd really. It's not something that most people, I think, are really prepared for. And so a lot of the recovery didn't really have anything that you take for it. It's just like, drink a lot of water. You're going to pass it all out. You know, get outside a lot and breathe a lot of fresh air, which I did, and keep everything well ventilated. Keep checking in with people from outside, to make sure that things aren't wild or whatever. Just stay grounded, keep your head on your shoulders. Those are the kinds of suggestions that I got from the medical professional that was, helping me out at the time. And that's what Mercury led me to, was just reasonable, level-headed advice from a reasonable, level-headed, actually qualified medical professional. And I mean, sometimes that's the equal sign in the middle. Sometimes that's the connection you need. Mercury is not a very haughty god. Mercury is not a planet that thinks it is above everyone and holds it over everyone. Um, Instead, Mercury is very humble. That's why Mercury is often associated with the tradesmen, or rather, it's a part of Mercury being associated with the tradesmen. Mercury is a very blue collar worker. Mercury wears a hard hat. He has this rounded helm with like a rim around like a kind of a flat rim and a circle around it, and there's wings on it. The winged helm of Mercury. He has like winged sandals for traveling around on. He goes on foot a lot. Mercury is your Grubhub driver. Mercury is your UPS deliveryman. Mercury delivers for you. and Mercury just, I feel, I'm not going to say doesn't stop working. I mean, we all sleep maybe a third or a fourth of the day, like 8 hours, 8 to 24. That's a third. Well, Mercury goes towards the past instead of the future 1/3 of the time. So Mercury does, lay down and sleep and rest the same as all of us, just in his own way. But Mercury is always at work doing something. If Mercury is not doing his day job, then he is working on restoring himself. He is working on healing. And when he does that, he does it in a balanced manner where he allocates the energy that he'd usually do his work with towards healing. Mercury goes retrograde to heal, And when going retrograde, cannot go forward at the same time. Cannot go forward and backward at the same time. Has to do one or the other. Bipolar to some extent, yes, but balanced as well. Now, like I said, not perfectly balanced. That 1/3, 2/3 thing means that the scales are always a little like this when it comes to Mercury's work ethic. I'd call Mercury a bit of a workaholic. I'd call Mercury maybe a little bit of a perfectionist. And when you factor in those delusions, sometimes that can be very dangerous. But like I said, Mercury works best in groups. You can bring in Venus, you can bring in Saturn, you can bring in Jupiter, you can bring in any of them, and they can be there to provide the balance that sometimes Mercury need on either side of it to form a more complete equation, to give you a more complete solution to whatever it is that you're facing in your life right now. All of the planets work together. All of them are rotating around the sun together. The sun is considered one of them in terms of the alchemical planets anyway. The whole system is the whole system. Mercury's not alone. Mercury's always working with his family of planets to do something. And in fact, looking to one of them for perspective when you have confusion about Mercury, when other planet, to gain an understanding of what's going on with Mercury. And if it turns out that you have strange perceptions and you also have some strange smells in your house, maybe check out and see if there's a gas leak, because that's useful knowledge to have as well. I think Mercury would say the same. Anyway, everybody stay safe, stay warm. Enjoy playing pickleball. Apparently that's taking over. I don't really get that, but whatever. And peace.